Şimdi sözü Philip Brown Bey'e veriyorum. Aslında tebliği birkaç hamle ihtiyar insani ve kudret-i ilahiye şeklinde ifade edilebilir. Yani Osmanlı kelamında ilahi irade, ilahi kudret ve insan iradesi arasında yapılan tartışmalar bu bağlamda tebliğini sunacaktır. Buyurun.
İlk önce ben de bu sempozyumun organize edilenine çok teşekkür ederim. Ben aslında bu böyle akademisyen, harika bir akademisyen grubu aynı konferansa katılabildiğime çok memnunum. Çok şanslıyım kendime hissediyorum. Teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi ben ana dilime geçeyim. This presentation will discuss what I think is a very important debate in the history of Ottoman era Kalam that occurred in the 18th century over the nature of human freedom and divine omnipotence. Based on Ibn Hammam's discussion of individual intention, a group of 18th century Ottoman Kalam scholars attempted to outline a specifically Maturidi understanding and defense of human free choice and individual actions. These scholars included Muhammad ibn Mustafa Hamid al-Katabi al-Kirmani, Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Muljanabi, and Dawood al-Karsi. Muljanabi's works, to my knowledge, only exist in manuscript in the Suleymaniye Kütüphanesi. Dawood al-Karsi obviously has many editions and translators. These scholars turned this important theological question al-ikhtiyar al-juz'i or al-irada al-juz'iyya, partial choice or partial will. This presentation will analyze their works on this issue, including Al-Kirmani's Af'al al-Ibad, wal-iradat al-juz'iyya, Muljanabi's Risala fi Bahth al-iradat al-juz'iyya, and Karsi's Risala fi Bayan Masalat al-ikhtiyarat al-juz'iyya, wal-idrakat al-qalbiyya. My argument is that these theologians elaborated and attempted to elaborate a specific space, in a theological space in which human freedom could take place. They were very concerned with proving that there was some moment during every human act that was motivated by human intention or human desire. And this is what caused, not directly ontologically, but this is what gave God these sort of impetus to create the human act and to create the situation for acquiring the act. And this, my point is that this idea was implicit in Maturidi's text. Maturidi makes a similar point, that a human motivation has to occur before the act is created, but that a specific theological argument for this was not made until the 18th century in the Ottoman period. And one of the great contributions of the Maturidi scholars from the Ottoman period was to create a specifically theological way of defining this idea that sort of is implied in Maturidi. And so I'll talk a little bit about this debate. As we know, as we talked about yesterday, the Ottoman Medrese curriculum very strongly favored Asharism, but as the point was made yesterday and briefly this morning by our conference by the panel leader, there were scholars who specifically preferred Maturidism, famously someone like Hizr ibn Jalaluddin al-Rumi, Hizr Bey, in the 15th century, who authored the very first explicitly Maturidi text in the Ottoman period of Qasida and Niyya. Other scholars such as Kafi Hassan Effendi al-Aqsari, and his work Kitab al-Tawheed, or actually his work Rawdat al-Janat fi Usul al-I'tiqadat, which interestingly in the manuscript version he says he wrote because he was inspired when he discovered a physical copy of Maturidi's Kitab al-Tawheed at a library in Mecca, just by chance. He'd never seen one in Istanbul. He happened across one in Mecca and it inspired him to write his treatise. And also, like was talked about very interestingly and in detail yesterday, Mali Zadeh's works, and also his texts on Abu Hanifa's theology. So these are all people who, even during this highly synthetic period of theology in the Ottoman Empire, were willing to say that they followed Maturidiyya, and they were willing to show a preference for that theological school. The most dramatic assertion of a distinctly Maturidi theological identity came in the form of this theological controversy in the 18th century over the understanding of the Maturidi term for freedom of ikhtiyar. Ikhtiyar being Maturidi's term to define the choice, the part of choice that human beings have in committing an action. It's found all over Maturidi's text. It doesn't come up very often in Ash'ari, of course, as we all know, and except in some of his works that are attributed to him by his followers. The controversy seems to have had its roots in one section of a famous work by Ibn al-Humam. In his Al-Musayra fil Aqa'id al-Manjiyah fil Akhirah, Ibn al-Humam elaborates on this feature of Maturidi's doctrine. This point has its roots in Maturidi himself, who argued that human freedom has no meaning if human beings do not choose or intend their actions before God actually decides to create them. Thus, human intention is prior in some sense to the divine creation event, though Maturidi and Ibn al-Humam make the point that even human intention is somehow created by God. They're sort of trapped in a bit of a circle, but they try to make both points simultaneously. Humans choose or intend a course of action, and then God empowers them, gives them the qudrat, with the ability to carry out this action, creates the action for them. Nasafi also makes the same point. But the question is, Maturidi and Nasafi posit the existence of this human intention as ikhtiyar, but they don't explain how ikhtiyar works. Where does it come from? What function does it play? Is it created by God? How does it relate to God's own power and foreknowledge? So these questions were answered by the 18th century Ottoman theologians. Ibn al-Humam terms this moment of what I call sort of unburdened human freedom the al-azam al-musammam, definitive resolve, definitive choice, or it's a very odd terminology. But he uses it, he's the, near as I can tell, the first one to use this phrase, this novel period. In an attempt to clarify the origin of this, quote, definitive resolve, azam al-musammam, Ibn al-Humam argues that human intention is, like the act itself, created by God. This creation, however, does not compromise the freedom of the human being in making decisions in their innermost heart. This is where the title for later treatises of Idrakat al-Qalbiyya come from. They try and create this space in the heart where these intentions take place. The most popular of these treatises that talks about this internal part of the human being that makes this decision was Kirmani's treatise, a very famous scholar who enjoyed wide professional success as a Qadi in Izmir, Egypt. And he eventually became the Qadi of Mecca 1 year before his death. And his treatise, Iradat al-Juz'iyya, has dozens and dozens of copies in the Suleymaniya archive, and has been described in detail by Shamil Doshan. The next most popular treatises on the subject, based on the number of extant manuscripts that I could find in Suleymaniya, were by a certain Muljanebi, about whom little seems to be known, and the famous scholar Dawood al-Karsi, both of which have many copies in the Suleymaniya Kitchpan Sin. Dawood al-Karsi, incidentally, his work was actually approved by Kirmani himself once Dawood arrived to Istanbul to complete the studies. Another example of these treatises, called Mumayyizat Madhhab al-Maturidiyya Ma'an al-Madahib al-Khairiyya by al-Erzurumi, meaning Hizbiri Qadizadeh, has also been edited by the German Edward Badin. The most striking feature of these treatises is that they posit themselves as Maturidi alone. They make that choice deliberately. And they offer a critique of what they understand to be the Ash'ari understanding of human freedom. The copyist of Dawood al-Karsi's treatise in the one of the Istanbul manuscripts, for instance, and I find this very interesting, says he thanks God for making him and his colleagues Maturidi, as opposed to being Ash'ari. To make such a strong assertion in the Ottoman period, as we've been talking about, would have stood out as syncretic and sort of synthetic and syncretistic, very Kapsaja kind of environment that these scholars were living in. So to have someone thank God for being Maturidi was a bit strong. All of these scholars copy or quote Ibn al-Humam on this issue, and they describe the moment of intention as very important and crucial to the execution of the act. However, they go a step further in trying to safeguard this moment of human intention. They assert that not only does this occur in the innermost heart of a human being, such as idrakat qalbiyya, but they also assert, somewhat interestingly, that it cannot be defined as either created or uncreated. They take it outside the discussion of khalq. They argue that since intentions exist only in the innermost heart of a human being, they therefore have no existence fil kharij, they have no existence in the outside world, which is, as we talked about yesterday, a metaphysical category, very common Ottoman thinking, comes from Egypt and other late Ash'aris. So therefore, as human intentions have no exterior existence fil kharij, they actually cannot be described by the terms created or uncreated. Rather, intention, these theologians assert, is best described as a hal, as a state of the human being. Izbiri el-Izrulni provides a succinct summary of this intention with the quote, "The human being's expenditure of his power towards a specific end, the action, is the intention in the sense that it proceeds from the person. It is also a purely relational matter, it means it's not present in the outside world and does not pertain to creation." End quote. Al-Kirmani breaks down the act in the following ways to make the same point. Each act has 5 parts. The conception of the act, which is attributable to God. The desire for the act, also attributable to God. The movement of the limbs, of course, created by God's power. And then God's creation of the action after a person chooses it. And the choice itself, which according to Al-Kirmani is also not created. In other words, the theological argument here attributes everything to God's direct power except for the moment of intention, which in some sense lies inside the heart of the human being and somehow is different from the creation of khalq, although ultimately it must come from God's power in some way. The last point I want to make is that this argument inspired very passionate refutations from Ash'ari thinkers in the same period, most famously Abdul Ghani al-Nablusi, who wrote an entire treatise, Tahqiq al-Intisar al-Ittifaq al-Ash'ari wal-Maturidi al-Khalq al-Ikhtiyar. He wrote an entire treatise trying to argue against this idea that was come up with by these Maturidi thinkers. He says that definitively ikhtiyar is a part of creation. It is a created, it's makhluk, it's not haram. And that it must have existence in the outside world. Nablusi is highly critical of this kind of thinking, and he even argues that as Sunnis, Maturidis and Ash'aris all have to believe in what he calls jabr muqayyad, a kind of restricted or some kind of form of forcing by God that somehow restricted and includes human action. So what's interesting about this is that in this theological environment, these Maturidi thinkers wanted to make such a strong point about human freedom, and in doing so, they provoked a very strong reaction by Ash'aris who tried to sort of go even further to the other direction. What I find interesting about this debate, and the last point that I'll make, is that this moment where Maturidi thinkers in the 17th century made a very strong attempt to safeguard a moment of pure human freedom given by God to human beings, seems to have later echoes in 19th century Ottoman thinking and even in the Republican period. I think that this part of Maturidi thinking was later picked up by modernists, by what they call the Yenilikçilik akımları, was picked up by them in the 19th century, and then actually helps to sort of go on and create some of the major theological ideas in modern Turkish and Republican period. So I think this moment in Maturidi Kalam in the Ottoman period is somewhat forgotten. It's sitting over in the manuscript archives right now. but I think it played a major role in creating modern Ottoman Kalam and then modern Turkish theology as well. Teşekkür ederiz.
Teşekkür ederiz. Bilip Bey'e. Osmanlı son dönem alimleri arasında irade-i cüz'iye tartışmalarını bize başarıyla sundu. Aslında insan iradesi yaratılmış mı, yaratılmamış mı konusunu inceledi. Maturidi'nin kendisinde insan iradesinin yaratılmamış olduğuna ilişkin bir kayıt bulunmamakla birlikte müteahhit veren Maturidiler, özellikle Osmanlı son döneminde irade-i cüz'i risalesi yazan alimler, insanda Allah Teala'nın iradenin yaratılmamış olmasını sağlayan bir mekanizma yaratmıştır. Dolayısıyla irade yaratılmamıştır şeklinde bir neticeye gidilmiştir. Ancak son dönem Osmanlı alimlerinden Mustafa Sabri Efendi bunu eleştiriyor. Malumunuz olduğu üzere diyor ki insan yaratılmışsa yaratılmamış bir şey onda nasıl olabilir şeklinde bir itiraz ileri sürüyor.